What do historic buildings and art mean to the historian? Hello, I'm Richard Harwood, a barrister at 13 Essex Chambers.
And I'm Clarissa Levy, Art and Heritage Counsel at Wedlake Bell.
And we're delighted to have with us today Dr. Elizabeth Norton. Elizabeth is a historian specialising in the Queens of England and the Tudor period, and she is the author of highly readable books, including recently The Lives of Tudor Women and The Temptation of Elizabeth Tudor. So, Elizabeth, delighted to have you with us this morning.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for inviting me on.
What we were thinking on this one was that as sort of heritage professionals, we often talk about the historic interest of historic buildings and sites and so on. And in terms of art, look at art from the perspective of the interest in the art itself. What we're going to sort of talk about today is, well, to what extent are historic buildings and art actually of use and of interest to the historian? So, helps with sort of how, but firstly, let's look at buildings. How historic buildings help you in terms of your work?
I think they're invaluable. It's obviously most of my work is in the archives, sort of pouring through documents, trying to read Tudor handwriting. But actually getting out into the field and getting a sense of the place is really important. For example, Nonsuch Park, which has what little remains of Nonsuch Palace, which was Henry VIII's great last building project. There's nothing there of the site, but if you go and visit the site, you can get a sense of the size of the building at least. So they've marked out the extent of the building following excavations with posts. And actually, that gives you a sense of it being quite an intimate space that wouldn't necessarily have come across in the records of the building of this palace. So it can be really important. I'm also working on a book on reigning queens from sort of across the world and across time at the moment. And it's been really invaluable to go and visit some of the sites, the Temple of Hatshepsut at Luxor, for example, and get a sense of what these women were building and the grandeur. So I think it does absolutely go hand in hand.
And in terms of the work on the Tudor period, obviously quite a lot of written sources, but how much they tell us about how the kings and queens and the court lives compared to, say, looking at Hampton Court Palace?
So it's variable. Obviously we have accounts, so we know what they're building quite often. Henry VIII obviously has very extensive building accounts, but going there really does enhance and sort of helps you understand. For example, in excavations at Whitehall Palace, they discovered that Henry VIII had a Turkish bath there. That's nowhere recorded in the records. It's simply they found remains of the stove, they found remains of day beds. So things like that are really important. Hampton Court is a fabulous survival. Obviously, only half of the Tudor Palace survives. William III, unfortunately, knocked down the back half in the 17th century. But we have the remains of some of the state apartments of Henry VIII. His own apartments actually do survive, but they're not open to the public, unfortunately. But they do give you a sense of moving from space to space to space. We have this grand great hall, one of the largest great halls that Henry VIII would have occupied. And this is, to some extent, this would have been the staff canteen in the Tudor period, but it's also used for events. We have plays, we have masques. And then you move through a series of rooms. So we have the great watching chamber next, which is where the nobility will eat. It's where people wait for the king. And then you move down and you get into these sort of series of smaller rooms. So it does give you a sense of how the king lived, which is very important. And it's not something that you can necessarily see in documents or even in depictions of the king. There are a few depictions of the king inside his apartments, but none of them really give you this sense of actually going to visit them.
And in terms of the sort of intrigue of the Tudor court and the sort of the plotting and so on, does the layout of the rooms and the buildings cast light on whether people were likely to have bumped into each other when they said they did and so on?
Oh, yeah. In Tudor account sort of records, they love conspiring, particularly in oriel windows. They're a popular place for them to stand because actually there would have been lights there. And I think when you go to visit palaces like Hampton Court, or St. James's Palace, which is occasionally open to the public, you get a sense of just what life was like. It would have been very, very dark, for example. Candles were very expensive. Really, unless you're the king, you don't have full-time access to candles. So actually, there are lots of dark corners, and you can see that when you go to visit. It would have been quite a crowded place. The King's Court has around 600 people or so in it at any one point. Most of them don't have bedrooms. That always surprises people. The servants will just lay out their bed mats wherever they can find a space, or in the Great Hall or in corridors. So you would be stepping over people as you wander around in the dark. But it does to visit the places. And obviously, they have a modern gloss. Eltham Palace, for example, has a surviving Great Hall, but it's been, to a large extent, quite Disneyfied at the start of the 20th century. So you have to kind of try and strip back the modernity, and changes have been made over time. But it really does help situate the people that you're writing about or researching in their habitats. And particularly, I mean, I think conspiring definitely goes on in these palaces.
And has there been an occasion when you read about something, you researched something, and then you sort of gone to the building or gone to the site, and that's changed how you've thought about it?
Yeah, absolutely, because you do read with quite preconceived ideas. And I think actually going to visit the site, particularly a lot of the palaces are quite small in the Tudor period. And again, we're sort of used to Hampton Court, which is a vast palace, second only really in size to Whitehall, which was the biggest palace in Europe until Versailles. But I think actually going to visit palaces, and there are bits of Henry VIII's palaces surviving all over the place. Otford has a surviving tower, for example. Knowle actually belonged to Henry VIII for a brief period, and that's a very grand mansion in Kent. But it gives you a sense of just how squeezed in everybody was. And I think that really does change your impressions. We're kind of used to perhaps a sort of an 18th century view, and we tend to cast that back onto the 16th century, where we have these grand spaces, these women with these huge dresses moving through these huge spaces. But actually in the Tudor period, it's not necessarily like that. And certainly if you go back in time to the 15th and earlier, palaces are very much smaller scale than I think we would normally assume. So their lives are crowded. Their lives are under observation almost all the time. And Henry VIII will never be alone. I mean, he even has a groom of the stall who is involved with sort of assisting him in his toileting needs. So actually, I think what is really clear from visiting the sites, and which doesn't come across in the documents, is just how closely confined everybody is in the Tudor court.
And in the television and film versions of sort of Tudor history, I know you advised on some of those, does that sort of come over accurately enough, or is that still slightly there's a sort of big hall with everybody milling around, but actually they're all a bit more sort of hugger-mugger than modern dramas suggest?
It does and it doesn't. I mean, all period dramas have their faults. All period dramas get things right. I consulted on a recent feature film called Firebrand, which gets fairly criticised for its ending. That was nothing to do with me. But it deals with the last years of Henry VIII and his marriage to Catherine Parr. And what I was very keen for them to get across, and which I spent quite a lot of time with them working on, is this claustrophobic atmosphere. The rooms are small. In fact, the rooms get smaller as the Tudor period progresses. Henry VIII likes having a suite of rooms that goes room, then room, then room, then room, and they get progressively smaller and access becomes more restricted. And in Firebrand, you get this real sense of claustrophobia. Partly it's a mental state for Catherine Parr, who is clearly feeling overwhelmed and frightened, as I think anyone married to Henry VIII towards the end of his life perhaps would do. But also it's physically, there are people in the room, they're crowded into these small spaces. They've got dark paneling on the walls. They've got the tapestries sort of looming in. That is, I think, a really important thing to bring across. Not everybody does it so well. The BBC, when they did their Six Wives of Henry VIII series and then Elizabeth R in the 70s, they do it very well. I think partly that was budget constraints. So a lot of Elizabeth I's life particularly seems to take place in about 5 or 6 rooms. But actually, it does give you a sense of the fact that these living spaces are not big.
So it's probably something about 1970s BBC recording studios, not as anything else. But it's nice that they got it right, even if it might have been by mistake.
I was in Versailles a couple of weeks ago, and seeing the secret passage between the bedrooms and the sense that you get when you're actually in the rooms that you can't go through without, you just know that people are waiting to pounce on you as you go through the Henry VIII's, the enfilade of room by room by room. You're never going to get anywhere without people waiting for you to make their point or ask their question.
With Henry VIII, we know absolutely there are people just waiting. He walks to chapel and there are people thrusting petitions at him. But again, he does have the secret space in the same way as Versailles. We know, for example, that he had apartments at one of his palaces where he had a secret staircase that connected to Thomas Cromwell's rooms, for example. So clearly there is more going on behind the scenes. They're able to consult privately without people seeing. And Thomas Cromwell actually moves out of those rooms so that Jane Seymour's brother can move in, so that Henry can meet with Jane Seymour in private before their marriage, for example. So there is almost this kind of secret world in palaces that we don't necessarily see on the tours. I mean, if you look very carefully at Hampton Court, particularly actually in the William III apartments, you can see doors cut out in the panelling, which would have been used by the servant. So effectively, your kind of quintessential secret door. And you're not necessarily permitted to go through there, but there is this entire sort of back world as well, which potentially the king could access.
We talked quite a bit about the royal palaces and the grand buildings and so on. But in terms of understanding how more normal people lived, whether that was the merchants and the traders or the conventional sort of workers and peasants and so on, how much has buildings and perhaps archaeology helped the historian in understanding that?
So, I mean, with the Tudor period, we're quite lucky that a few more ordinary houses do survive. And I think most market towns will have some 16th century buildings in, perhaps 15th century. I know the school I went to had a 15th century part on a sort of medieval high street, for example. So they do survive. Obviously, they have been changed over time. But so we are able to see into houses of more ordinary people to some extent in the Tudor period, perhaps not so much in London, because unfortunately there was a Great Fire and not many medieval buildings survived, but certainly in other parts of the country. Archaeology is also absolutely crucial. And actually, when excavations were carried out at Nonsuch Palace, for example, they discovered the village of Cuddington that lay underneath the palace. Henry VIII had actually demolished an entire village to build his palace. So they were able to actually identify the houses, the parish church, which was also flattened to make way for the palace. And so that gives you a real sense of daily life. And so archaeology is very important. And because actually archaeological surveys tend to be carried out for most major building works in at least historic town centres today, actually the Tudor period often does become the most visible period they tend to identify. It's obviously higher up in the layers than the medieval period. So you do get a sense of daily life.
So, an awful lot of archaeological work is prompted by development projects and requires recording and writing up. So that work actually is genuinely useful to the historian.
Absolutely, really crucial. And the Tudor layers are easy to identify, and they tend to have green glazed pottery, which almost always points you towards the Tudors. But they're absolutely important. I mean, for London, for example, we have surviving maps. So we know where individuals' buildings were. We tend to have, to some extent, we have building plans so we can get a sense of what buildings were like. Tall, sort of leaning out over the street with the jettying in Tudor London, for example. I mean, it would have been, to some extent, the streets were almost roofed with these people squeezing a bit more space in their upper floors. But the archaeological work, I mean, it's a hassle in development, but I think it is absolutely crucial. And often there is quite a lot surviving in historic towns, in Winchester, for example, in Bristol, in Norwich. Norwich was actually the second largest town in England in the Tudor period. So a very important and wealthy place. So I think it is absolutely crucial because otherwise we are limited in what we know about these places. We're reliant on maps, we're reliant on documents. So actually being able to go and see what lies under the later city is very important.
I think listening to this podcast, there'll be quite a lot of archaeological consultants sort of punching the air at that point, which is always good to hear. In terms of sort of walking the ground, I mean, it sounds like sort of James Holland talking about battlefields, but there may be more than just sort of the battlefield. Just the sort of, you mentioned Nonsuch, but just sort of the walking around the historic estates and so on, does that also help in understanding how people lived and saw their world, really?
I agree, absolutely. I mean, even when there's not really anything remaining, as in Nonsuch, you can get a sense of place. You can get a sense of the lumps and bumps in the ground. And it does help to situate the people because, and I think this is something that historians today are much better at doing, but sort of even 50 or 60 years ago or so, people actually were not very good at humanizing the people of the past. They were almost sort of othered to some extent. And I think it is really important to situate people in the environments in which they lived. Certainly when I'm writing about somebody, I like to go and visit the places that they lived in. And a building such as Hampton Court, you're not going to get the sense of the Tudor Palace. For example, Henry VIII would have arrived at Hampton Court on boat on almost every occasion, but actually his Watergate is entirely gone. It's a 17th century entrance to the palace now from the river. So you're not going to be able to reconstruct that. But even somewhere like, for example, the palace at Blackfriars, Bridewell Palace, right in the centre of London, it's entirely gone. But actually the street names can give you a sense of what was once there. There's a street called Watergate, for example, and this is clearly before the embankment when the Thames was wider. This is where the king would disembark. We have sort of Palace Court and things like that. And they do really give you a sense of where the king was, where the river was, because the Thames has, of course, changed considerably. So it's really important.
Without wishing to always bring everything back to tax, which is my favourite thing. One of the first things I learned when I delved into the world of heritage advice is that you can't actually do any advice now, not really, without seeing the things. So in theory, on paper, you can look at a collection, a historic collection of objects and art that is at a palace or at a house, and you can sort of say which are preeminent and which can be what you can do what with. But actually, it's not until you go and see them, you actually clap eyes on a place and you walk from room to room, that you have any idea of how it was lived in, and therefore really whether it's possible to open it to the public and how meaningful that story will be. You have to clap eyes on things, and you can't really do anything unless you do.
And it does go hand in hand with historical research when you are writing about individuals or events. I mean, again, it's the same with battlefields. And I'm terrible with battlefields. I'm terrible at envisaging what was going on. But it's so important to just get a sense of this field and what was going on there.
And part of that is sort of the ability to sort of understand the human emotions and how people were thinking in the context that they're in, what their world is generally, and what their world is at that particular moment, whether it's Tudor court intrigue or it's standing on a battlefield.
Or heaving a real tennis racket at Hampton Court.
Yeah.
I think until you actually stand on the court with a real tennis racket in your hand, how are you supposed to know about, and talk about dark corners? There must have been plenty of intrigue in all of this. And they've all gone completely. Of the thousands and thousands of real tennis courts that there were all over Europe, there are a handful left.
Yes, I mean, the wall of the Whitehall one is in one of the government buildings on Whitehall now. I think it might be the Treasury, but you can actually see the old tennis court walls. But yeah, I mean, Henry VIII had a tennis court in all his major palaces. It was a major passion of his. And actually, there aren't many left at all. Hampton Court's a good example, and really crucial because when people hear that Henry played tennis, they envisage him out on a grass court, a little bit like Tudor Wimbledon. But actually, of course, it's much more like squash, real tennis. And it's important, real as in royal, not as in true. But it's important, I think, to be able to see here. And we do get a lot of intriguing on the tennis courts. There are accounts of sort of fights breaking out and things like that. And actually, to see what this space is like, it's very different to how people would imagine a tennis court these days in general.
Actually, in Versailles, looking at the real tennis court there, that's now changed. It's a monument, and so it's not actually played on. But it's actually very interesting, the courts that are still played on, because I think that's keeping history alive in a really different way. It's completely different from just looking at a museum.
The other topic I wanted to sort of come to was to what extent art helps you as the historian, not so much thinking about the history of art, but what you gain from art to help you in terms of the characters and the period you're dealing with. How useful is that?
So, I mean, the Tudor period, we're really lucky in that it is the period in English history where you do start to get portraits of not just the monarch, but also members of their court. So it does help you put a face to the name, which is fabulous. What I would say with Tudor portraiture is you're not necessarily getting a sense of what the person actually looked like. There are a lot of bad artists really until Hans Holbein arrives in the middle of Henry VIII's reign. So some of the early portraits are fairly shocking in their quality. Really, until the king started paying more, he wasn't necessarily able to attract better artists. But even if you're fairly sure this isn't a very accurate portrait, and I mean, there are lots of portraits of the same person which really don't look similar, you can still get a sense of how are they dressed. For example, Jane Seymour wears some religious pendants in some of her portraits, which is interesting in itself that she has chosen to wear these for her portrait. Elizabeth I, actually, in the family of Henry VIII, which is a huge portrait at Hampton Court depicting Henry, his deceased wife Jane Seymour, and their son Edward with his two daughters beyond the pillars to show that they're in the family, but not in the family. But actually Elizabeth I, and it's the first representation of Elizabeth that survives, she's actually wearing an A pendant to mark her out as Anne Boleyn's daughter, which is fascinating. Almost certainly she didn't sit for this portrait, but it's been done to mark her out, to demonstrate, this is Anne Boleyn's daughter. So actually looking at what they're wearing is really important. And also pose. We're very used to seeing Henry VIII facing forwards, legs wide, looking enormous. And this comes from the Whitehall mural, which was painted by Hans Holbein and unfortunately doesn't survive anymore. But actually in the original cartoon, which does survive, Henry was off to the side slightly. And at some point, Holbein has taken a decision to make him face the viewer. And it's a pose that's been replicated so many times in portraits of Henry VIII. And it speaks to you about what Henry is trying to convey. And I think that's very important. It is also nice to be able to see what people look like. And unfortunately, a lot of Tudor portraits are unidentified. There's a fabulous one at Hampton Court, which shows a man wearing hugely rich dress. He's wearing red satin. He's got black work embroidery on his shirt, which is really expensive. We don't know who he is. which is really unfortunate. Clearly very wealthy, but don't know who he is. So there are limits to what the portraits can tell us, but also they can tell us a great deal, and they can certainly tell us a lot about the court and the people who populate the court. We also get servants occasionally in the background of portraits, which is interesting to see. Henry VIII liked to be painted with his full Will Sommers quite regularly, actually. In fact, Sommers is one of the most painted people of Henry's reign.
Just picking up a couple of the points there, suggesting that the role of portraiture possibly still is as a presentational device, that people are making points by the pendants that Jane Seymour chooses to wear, or where Elizabeth is placed in the family portrait and so on, and the sort of the robust sort of king in charge sort of face-on presentation of Henry, assuming that the sitters had a bit more control over portraiture than perhaps the painters do compared to today. Is that an indication of their character, or an indication of the way in which, to some extent, the power politics is working?
I think it's a bit of both. We know people do sit for their portrait. Jane Seymour definitely sits for her Holbein portrait, for example. So I think they are making the decisions themselves about how they want to be presented. Elizabeth I, for example, is painted during her reign wearing a dress that's got little ears, human ears embroidered onto it. Whether or not she actually owned a dress with ears on, I've never come across a record that she did. But the point is, she's saying she hears everything. And that's the iconography. And her portraits are absolutely full of iconography. She's depicted holding a sieve, for example, which is a symbol of virginity. There are pearls, which are again a symbol of virginity. So for Elizabeth, they are very much, the iconography is more important than the portrait in many respects. Elizabeth I's portraits become increasingly mask-like as the reign goes on. They clearly are not representing the real woman. And actually, descriptions of Elizabeth towards the end of her life are really not reflected in the portraits. And she's lost most of her teeth. She's, of course, aged. She's 69 when she dies, which is an elderly age for the Tudor period. But actually, you would still think she was in her 30s from the surviving portraits. So they're not really portraits as we would know them. And someone holding a portrait of the Queen wouldn't necessarily be able to identify her as the woman in the portrait. But the point is what they say. They show the majesty. They show the Virgin Queen. They show Gloriana. So we're still viewing her through this propaganda. So I think that's very important. So yes, people do very much use them in the Tudor period as a way of getting a message across. And this is how we view them.
To what extent is the art of that period helpful in explaining what objects were or how people lived?
I mean, it can be really useful. Sometimes you see them holding things and you think, well, what is that? Backgrounds are really important as well, actually. For example, again, in the family of Henry VIII portrait, which is, they're shown at Whitehall, so inside a throne room at Whitehall. We can see the gardens through the open doors at the side, which gives you a sense of what the gardens look like, and very formal. They also have a painted floor, so that's really useful. So things like flooring and what's on the walls, we get almost entirely from paintings. They tend to have rush mats on the floor, or sometimes they will plaster the floor and paint it to look like marble, particularly on the upper floors. So actually, it's really interesting to look at the backgrounds of the paintings. We can also see what they're reading quite often. They'll often have books in the pictures, and that's really interesting to see. Sometimes you can identify the book from the picture.
How much does the art help us in terms of what sort of ordinary life was like, or is it later paintings in history which are sort of useful in that as we get into the Victorian period and so on?
So most of the English paintings, at least in Henry VIII's reign, are more formal portraits. So they can give you a sense of ordinary life with servants in the background, but you're not going to get a huge amount of lower status life. I always point people in the direction of Peter Bruegel the Elder for daily life in the 16th century. And he is, of course, a Dutch artist, but he painted scenes as peasant weddings, as peasant dances, for example. He did a number of nativities where the three kings are arriving, and they're very clearly, they've arrived in the 16th century Netherlands rather than sort of 16th century, 2000 years ago in the Holy Land. So he's fabulous because he does give you a sense of what daily life was like. My favourite of his is Children's Games, which actually shows a town that's been taken over by children, and they're all playing different games. And we can see children with hobby horses. There are children playing paper, scissors, stone. There's a child that's set up a sort of play shop. There are children playing with all sorts of toys. And actually, it's so fascinating because we just wouldn't have this detail otherwise. So art can be really important. It is more limited, particularly in England, with more ordinary life. But you can see it in the 16th century, and particularly with Bruegel's work.
I was reading sort of a comment by Judith Flanders, who writes a lot about Victorian life and Victorian cities and the Victorian house and so on. And she was saying in the introduction to one of her books that she looked quite a lot at paintings in terms of what they're showing in the background, and also at Victorian fiction, not at the sort of the key plot twists and the plot points, but just how they describe people moving about and doing things and their homes and so on, as casting a light on what life was like. So there's probably more information as we go through the centuries than that.
Yeah, I mean, in the Tudor period, you don't get really any fiction writing. I mean, that certainly is slightly in England, it's sort of later period. But we do have surviving letters. We've got some surviving diaries towards the end of the 16th century as well, usually by women, although actually Edward VI kept a diary, although it's not the most exciting of documents. So if you go into the non-fictional documents, you can get a sense of what life was like. Journals particularly are useful, and we have accounts of women walking around their estates. Lady Margaret Hoby, for example, who is a late 16th century gentlewoman who carries out medical care on her estates, for example. And we have accounts of her visiting her peasants in their cottages and sort of bandaging their wounds. She even carries out amateur surgery at one stage. So yes, you can get a sense of how they move around their environment. Letters are also really good, and you do get personal letters in this period. I mean, we have one letter where Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth wife, tells her fourth husband that if she'd been standing closer to the Lord Protector, she would have bitten him. She was so angry. But it gives you a sense of these meetings. So although we don't have the fiction, we do have Shakespeare's plays as well, of course, from the Elizabethan period. And of course, these are fiction. So we do also have plays. And although they don't have stage directions in general, there are a few, they do give you a sense of how people are moving around spaces. And Shakespeare, of course, would have been quite familiar with the court.
Does the art that we've got from Tudor period or otherwise help us on sort of cultural influences in terms of picking up foreign influences and so on, this particular case of England's place in the world?
Yes, absolutely. England's place in the world very much changes in the 16th century. Henry VIII didn't really show much interest in the New World, but certainly is interested in France. He considers himself to be King of France, as all of England's later medieval and Tudor kings do. And you get a sense in his portraits of the way he's displaying himself. If you look sort of closely, you can see items that he's purchased from abroad, and particularly in inventories, actually, we know that he's purchasing quite widely. He likes to dress up as well, although he's not painted in any costumes. We know Henry VIII has Turkish dress and Russian dress. He also has a Robin Hood costume that he likes to wear. Certainly in Elizabeth's reign, later on, we do get a real sense of the world opening up in portraiture. And there's a fabulous portrait that was actually painted of the Moroccan ambassador who arrives in, I think, 1600, and actually has his portrait painted in London while he's there. And that's a fabulous portrait because he's in full ceremonial Moroccan dress. He's got a turban, he's wearing his sword, he's wearing robes. So you do get a sense of the world opening up. And you can see it in the dress in the later 16th century. You can see it in the fabrics that they're using, because a lot have come from the broader world. Elizabeth, for example, is in correspondence with the Ottoman court, particularly with the emperor's mother, in fact. Also is involved in an alliance with Morocco. So there are better trade routes. I mean, Elizabeth deals arms to the Ottoman Empire, for example, in exchange for quite a lot of money. So you can see it in the portraits if you take a sort of closer look. So you do get a sense of the world opening up, and it's obviously accompanied by the documents and other media. We also get drawings of, certainly in the next reign, in James's reign, we get drawings of Native Americans that the English encounter during the early settlements in North America. And there is a sense of this world opening up, and you can really see it in art.
Elizabeth, thank you. What are your current projects?
So I'm working on a book on reigning queens, which is looking at trying to build a model for what a reigning queen is. So it's effectively being head of state, so crowned head of state, over time, and to see whether it still sort of has relevance today. So that's been absolutely fascinating to research. So I'm actually sort of deep into medieval Japan at the moment in my research, which is a bit of a departure from what I usually do. On the academic side, I'm working on a monograph on Jane Seymour, which is fascinating.
Elizabeth, thank you very much. Look forward to those works, and I've been reading your Catherine Parr book and been enjoying that immensely, and seeing the photos you've taken around the sites and so on.
Can't wait for those. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Art and Heritage Law Contested Heritage. Please do follow or subscribe on Apple or Spotify podcasts to enjoy more shows.
We have a new podcast out every fortnight. If you're able, please take the time to rate us and put down a review.
The show is also on the 39 Essex Chambers website, along with podcast series on topics such as artificial intelligence, climate change and planning.